It's George Gruhn, November 27, and hope you all had a happy Thanksgiving. We were closed yesterday, but obviously here we are today. Black Friday, although in general, our business is not so strictly based around Christmas or any other holiday. People want guitars of the type we carry, mostly for themselves. I often say we sell self-indulgence products, with the main recipients of the gift being people giving themselves a gift. So it doesn't necessarily result in a huge Christmas rush. On the other hand, we have a business that is perennial, so that it goes year after year and month after month. People want guitars. And even through a pandemic, they still want guitars. We've got plenty of questions today, so I'll just plow right in. But before plowing in, I would like to at least say that we buy, consign, and trade, and one does not simply have to walk in to do that. We ship guitars daily, and people ship to us daily. It is easy to send instruments by United Parcel Service, and that's the one we prefer most because I think that their insurance is good. And FedEx at least used to have and may still have a clause in their insurance policy that they don't cover instruments that are over 20 years of age. They don't want to handle non-replaceable collectibles. So be sure that if you ship something that it is indeed truly covered by insurance. But at any rate, we ship daily and business would grind to a halt if we couldn't. And for that matter, business would grind to a halt for makers of new instruments as well. Martin, Fender, Gibson, Taylor, Birch, Fender, you name it, they all have to get instruments to us somehow and to other dealers. And they just can't beam them over like on Star Trek with the transporter beam. They use companies like UPS to ship their guitars. And you can too. Dealing with us or anybody else you want to deal with, it is easy to send guitars virtually anywhere you want to within the USA. It's a bit more complex for overseas because you have not only customs documents, but more importantly, the documents for fish and wildlife, for certification of anything with CITES, covered items, endangered species. CITES is Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Without the right paperwork, your instrument can be confiscated. So that is an important consideration, but within the USA, shipping is extremely simple. And question from Mick. I currently have a 1967 Hagstrom Viking bought 40 years ago and much modified. I like the way it plays, but the build is lacking in quality and I have trouble keeping it in tune. I'm looking for an alternative. Can you recommend any hollow body guitars around the $2,500 mark? Well, in that price bracket, there are actually numerous instruments. In American-made instruments, I think some of the best that are used and somewhat vintage appeal would be from Guild. Their Starfire models are, for the most part, generally in that range, and they're good guitars. And Gibson also has instruments that, while they may not be true vintage, there are a goodly number of Gibson models that can be used in that price bracket. So hollow body, so some people might include even an ES335, which I would think of as semi-solid or semi-hollow, however you want to look at it, with a center block. But the point is, hollow body could be full depth or thin line. But there are numerous Guild models and actually a fair number of Gibson models. And there are also import guitars. And some of those import models are quite good. So I'm not going to be able to just give you any one particular model, but I can at least tell you that you can shop around and find numerous guitars that are stage-worthy in hollow body instruments in that price bracket. Thomas Van Tilburg's question, I have a Gibson L4. What gauge strings would you consider best for this jazz guitar? Now, Gibson has made L4 models for many, many years, and an L4, typically for an acoustic L4, is a 16-inch wide, full-depth, arch-top acoustic guitar. The early models prior to the 1930s were oval hole with a carved top and back. And then in the 30s, by 34 at least, they were F-hole arch tops rather than oval hole. And there are even some more recent L4s that are hollow body electrics with pickups, but I assume you're talking about the acoustic version of an L4. And what we would recommend is medium gauge acoustic strings. Archtop jazz guitars played acoustically are certainly not intended for light strings. Typically, archtops do best with medium gauge. And in the early days, for a lot of the orchestral players, they were putting heavy strings on, heavier than almost anything most people would use today. At any rate, the L4 is a good guitar, but then there are so many versions of the L4 over the years that all I can say is that I'm expecting it to be an acoustic archtop. It could be the early ones were all non-cutaway, and the later ones, the L4C, which came out in the late 40s, would be a cutaway, but either way, it still would do well with medium gauge strings, as with most other archtop acoustics. Bob Thibault says he bought a 4-string Philharmonic brand banjo made in Providence, Rhode Island, at an estate sale about 45 years ago. He'd like to know if it has collector's item value. I would suggest on that one, please send me photos to george@guitars.com, and I will get back to you on it and include it in our next question and answer session as well. And that question is not true only of this one instrument, but on a lot of oddball models, I can do a much better job answering questions if I see something, see the instrument. So send photos, and I will get back to you on that. June Grover now is a Mico, M-E-I-K-O guitar worth repairing if it is cracked. Well, that's a Japanese name. I'm not familiar with the brand. And without seeing as much as a photo, I can't tell you how bad the crack is. But some cracks are relatively easy to repair structurally, even if not cosmetically. And if, again, I can see photos of the instrument, I can probably give you more information on that. But it is certainly, in all probability, not a high dollar instrument, but still could be an instrument that could easily be set up in playing order. Wayne Lyles says, I was recently given a Conn guitar that belonged to a friend who passed away. I know it's not a really high-end guitar, but another friend suggested that they may be becoming collectible these days, that may have a solid top. At any rate, Conn was best known for wind instruments. They were located in Elkhart, Indiana, and they were a major maker of orchestral wind instruments, particularly a lot of student grade instruments, but some professional grade as well. The guitars I have seen that were Conn brand were Japanese made, and they were fairly typical of Japanese instrument quality of the 1970s. They were decent guitars, and the better ones did have solid tops. Are they collectible? I would say the one-word answer is no. It would be a good utility tool worth a few $100s and still could be a decent sounding instrument if properly set up. It's worth noting, though, that an instrument that may be 40 years old or more, or even 30 years old, could have structural problems. And without seeing the guitar or having it inspected by a repairman, I don't know whether it is something that will be economically practical to set up in good playing order. If it is easy to set up in good playing order, then it ought to be a fairly decent sounding guitar. The Kahn guitars I've seen were definitely not junk. They were serviceable, good quality imports that, while I would not say equal in quality to a Martin or Gibson, would still be a serviceable, reasonably good instrument. Eric King has asked a question. What's the best way to fix bubbling that shows up after spraying nitrocellulose lacquer? Well, once the finish is bubbling and dries with bubbles in it, not much you can do. It's an indication that something wasn't right in your spraying process. It's not supposed to have bubbles in it. And if it does, you either have poor quality lacquer or a spray gun that's not working properly, but something is wrong. And if you see bubbling in finish, if you are spraying finish, stop. And you may have to consult a good repairman. I would suggest there you could even call here and talk to some of our repair shop folks, but finishes should not have bubbles in them when dry. And you can sand it down and get past the bubbles and then respray another coat. But if you are the one doing the spraying, better check and see why it's bubbling, because it's not supposed to do that. And on a factory instrument, I would not expect to see bubbles in the finish from any high quality maker. So something is not right here. Question from Jeffrey. I have a Larrivee L9 with solid ebony back and sides and a red spruce top. What is your opinion on the use of ebony for guitar bodies? The sound of this guitar took a long time to open up, seems like years, but once open, it is impressive. Well, there's various different species of ebony, some of which have been used for guitar backs and sides. Macassar ebony is one of the more prominent in that regard. It's a wood that has a pretty bold, striking grain pattern. It's not just jet black uniform color. It has streaks of brown and occasionally whitish streaks and black. It's quite attractive. And it is a wood quite suitable for backs and sides. Requires some skill, however, to bend sides out of ebony. But it can be done. The sound of the Macassar ebony is somewhat like rosewood, but with a red spruce top and Macassar ebony back and sides, I would expect the guitar to have very good volume and a relatively deep bass. But it should be a very good sounding guitar. And the wood will sound certainly different from maple or mahogany or rosewood, but it would sound closer to the sound of rosewood than it would to either maple or mahogany. At any rate, it still is something that is attractive and can give good sound, and Larrivee is not the only one who has used that wood. A fair number of makers have built guitars with Macassar ebony back and sides. And typically these are not cheap guitars. So my experience is it's good. Kevin has written several questions actually, but starting with, what exactly is the purpose of a truss rod? I know it is used to adjust the relief of the neck fretboard, but does it strengthen the neck, and prevent warping? The answer is it does both. It is intended to strengthen the neck and prevent warping, and it also can be used to adjust the relief of the neck. It does not correct neck set angle. And that is a common misconception, that if you have a high action, that you're going to adjust action with the truss rod. That is not a good idea. If the action is high, in all probability, it needs adjustment either by a neck set or adjustment of the nut or saddle, or maybe both or all three. But simply lowering action is not what a truss rod is for. And many people who make that mistake and think you can just crank it down until the action is low, end up with a neck that's back bowed, or worse yet, if they tighten it too much, they break the rod, and then you can have a very expensive repair. You may have a guitar that looks perfect cosmetically, but with a broken rod, the neck is no longer adjustable and is likely to warp. So that's an issue. Second question from Kevin, is it safe to use medium gauge strings on a vintage mandolin which does not have a truss rod? Will medium gauge strings on those pre-truss rod mandolins cause the neck to bow and or pull the neck away from the body? Well, I guess the question there can only be answered by knowing first what brand mandolin is it. If it's an old Gibson mandolin made prior to 1921, it will not have an adjustable neck rod, but it was designed to be played with medium gauge strings. And it will hold them quite well, and it will not cause the neck to pull away from the body. The old A model Gibsons and F2 and F4 models were all designed for steel strings and for relatively heavy strings at that. They were designed for orchestral playing. But now if your mandolin is an old Martin mandolin or an old Oldback mandolin, or some of the Washburn flat top, flat back mandolins, those are absolutely not designed for medium strings. Most of those were designed for light strings. So again, it depends on the make and the model. For example, Martin made some arch top, carved back mandolins starting in the 20s. And they made more that were flat top, flat back. And the A series, they made A, B, C, D on up to E, but they were the flat top, flat back mandolins. Those were designed for light strings. And almost any mandolin you see that is not featuring a carved top and carved back was designed for light strings, whereas those with carved top and carved back were typically designed for at least medium strings. But again, it also depends very much on the brand of the mandolin. If it's a Gibson or Epiphone, the older pre-war Epiphones, those are all designed for at least medium strings. They're not designed for light strings if they're carved top and carved back. A third question from Kevin: what are the major factors which move a vintage mandolin out of the collectible category into the player category. And I'd like to take this question and change it a bit, and instead of just mandolin, just put fretted instrument, because this same question will apply equally to guitars, banjos, mandolins, and ukuleles. And that is, again, what are the major factors which remove a fretted instrument out of the collectible category into the player category? Or put another way, what's the border or dividing line that separates a collectible vintage instrument from a player? I know that refinishing an instrument automatically makes it a player and non-collectible. And even there, that particular question, if you have a pre-World War II Martin D28 or D45, or even a D18, if it's a 1937 model and it has an extremely fine professional refinish, it's not going to be worth nearly as much as one with original finish, but it doesn't immediately move into utility, and no collector's item appeal. Some things, if the job is done right, really, really well, may still be collectible, but we do not ever recommend stripping an original finish off of a truly collectible instrument, because even a superb refinish is going to reduce its value. However, if it's already been refinished poorly, we have no hesitation to strip off a bad refinish and do a really good refinish. And if it's a solid body electric, like a Fender or a Gibson solid body, a refinish will definitely still greatly reduce its collectability, but not its playability. And if you do a really, really good refinish, it can look so close to factory quality as to be hard to tell. And on examples like that, they still bring less money than one that is original. But if you have an original Fender broadcaster, a genuine broadcaster, and the finish has been stripped and it's been refinished really professionally, it's worth less than half of what it would have brought otherwise, but it still has collectability. It still is a collector's item. So it's not simply priced as utility tool only. But good work is better than bad work, but refinishing is not a good thing to do on a really significant vintage instrument. He goes on to say, what about if non-operational hardware are missing? Truss rod cover, pick guard, tailpiece cover, end pin. Is that instrument still collectible, or is it now a player? Well, everything you just named, truss rod cover, pick guard, tailpiece cover, and end pin, are parts that are non-functional. And if you replace all of those parts, the instrument's still a collectible, but it's at least reduced in value by the value of those parts. And if you could go out and find original parts, like a tailpiece cover, Gibson didn't make a tailpiece cover specifically for this one mandolin. They had a pile of them. If you can find a used one that's the same style and put it on, it's identical, no problem. Pick guard, pretty much the same. Truss rod cover, pretty much the same. End pin, I don't know anybody who's going to flip out completely if the end pin is missing and says it's no longer a collectible. These are interchangeable parts. Even if a tuning gear goes bad and you can find another one of the same make, same model, in the same condition, and you replace it, Grover and Waverly didn't just make tuners specifically for that one guitar. And when Martin, Gibson, Fender, whatever ordered tuners, they just bought them in bulk. They bought bass side and treble side tuners and had them in a big bin and reached in and grabbed them. If you replace a tuner or even a whole set with an identical set, there's no way to tell, and it really hasn't ruined the guitar. But if you put Grover Rotomatics on a guitar that had open back Grovers and you ream out the holes and the screw holes don't match and you've reamed out the shaft hole, you've done great harm. On the other hand, what if the owner has all the original operational parts, truss rod, tuning machines, bridge, tailpiece unit, but has to replace one of them so the instrument could be played, e.g. truss rod cover is present but no longer works. The truss rod is present but no longer works. Well, if truss rod is present but doesn't work, that's not the same as truss rod cover. Replacing a truss rod is a bigger deal. But if one truly needs to be replaced, if the job is done extremely well, the instrument still will be collectible. And we do repairs of this kind. You also ask about, or tuner buttons have disintegrated, or one of the keys was bent, or the original bridge was cracked. Again, all of these are repairs that we routinely do here. Plenty of tuner buttons deteriorate, plastic buttons, and actually some metal buttons that are pot metal also will deteriorate and need to be replaced. And we routinely do that kind of work. We indicate when we're selling the instrument that the work was done, but we do not feel that that kind of work automatically places it from collectible to utility grade. It's going to have some impact on value, but not dramatic, especially if the work is done well. And if the parts are identical, it has no impact on collectability or value. Another question, what woods were used on the backs and sides of Gibson A model mandolins of the teens and 20s? And again, this same question applies to the Gibson guitars of the teens and 20s, not just the mandolins. Gibson used birch on the backs and sides of A model mandolins and on the F2 model mandolin and on most of their guitars during the teens and 20s, at least through the mid-20s. In the mid-20s, starting in 25, you start seeing a lot of replacement of birch with maple. Actually, some of that starts even in late 24. But the F4 model mandolin always, in the earliest period, even pre-1910, had maple back and sides on the F4, but it was the only early Gibson mandolin that typically had maple. But on the A model mandolins and on many of the Gibson guitar models that were carved top and carved back, we see the transition from birch to maple starting late 24 and into 25. You'll see them discontinuing using birch and starting to use maple, although interestingly enough, in the catalogs, they typically specified that it was maple. Birch looks a lot like maple. And even though they used birch, some of the Gibson catalog literature of that time says maple. So far as sound, he also asked, does a one-piece birch back have an inferior sound to a two-piece back? The answer is nope. Two-piece back and one-piece back will sound virtually identical, and even Stradivari and Guarneri making violins that today can be $10 million did most of them with two-piece backs and some with one piece, and people don't pay extra for a one-piece back on a violin. And on guitars, a one-piece back is almost impossible to get a piece big enough so that almost all guitars have two-piece backs if they are solid wood construction. And when you see an archtop guitar that appears to have a one-piece back, that is 99% certain that it's a laminated back, and that what you're seeing is a veneer of maple that has the appearance then of having a one-piece back. But so far as solid backs of maple on a body that's 15 or 16, 17, or even 18 inches wide, nope, you're not going to be seeing that. Another question, if the fretboard on a vintage Gibson mandolin, and again, I'll substitute fretted instrument, doesn't matter if it's a mandolin or a guitar or a banjo, is pitted, what repair work would you recommend? Having a luthier fill in the pits or replacing the entire fingerboard? I know the latter would cost more, but wouldn't the results look better and last longer? Or does replacing the fretboard reduce the instrument's value and place it in a category of a player? Well, again, if you have a Lloyd Loar signed F5 mandolin or an early L5 guitar or a Martin D28, if you have a deeply pitted fingerboard, usually that is a sign, by the way, of people not trimming their fingernails, because when you play a guitar, if your fingernails are short and trimmed, the flesh of your fingers is not going to be creating deep divots in the fingerboard, the fretboard. I call it a fingerboard. A lot of people call it a fretboard, interchangeable term. When you see deep divots in the board, it's a sign that somebody had relatively long fingernails, and they should notice that it's digging in. They have plenty of ample warning that this is happening, but they don't bother to trim their nails anyway, and they can, I've seen people wear completely through an ebony board. That takes a lot of effort and time to do. It also takes mighty hard, strong fingernails. But if that is the case, there are a couple of solutions. You can just fill it in, and it's perfectly functional. You can take divots out and put plugs in the board, and in ebony, you can hide it fairly well. Or you can pull the frets only in the area where they're deeply pitted and put a veneer of ebony in place. So you don't have to replace the entire fretboard, just replace that one section, and not even the full depth of it, just a veneer, put it back, recut the fret slots, refret it, and it will look perfect. So all of that can be done, and if done really well, will still leave an instrument very much collectible, but almost all work that is truly needed to restore playability is worth doing. Major cosmetic work to cover what I consider honest wear is not necessarily a good deal to do. That means mostly finish work, refinishing. Deep divots in the fingerboard will not tremendously impact playability, because actually when you're playing the instrument, you're not pressing the string so much into the wood. In fact, if you look where these divots are, you'll notice this deep wear in a fingerboard is not caused by contact of the string with the fretboard. It is fingernail wear, and the positioning of the wear is where the fingernails contact. It's not where the strings are contacting the fretboard. Another question. My luthier with some 50 years of experience once said that all of the Chinese-made mandolins sound tinny and simply do not hold their value. Every Chinese-made instrument I've played, regardless of price, Eastman in particular, has proven the statement to be true. Why is that? Is it the wood that they're using or poor craftsmanship? I'm only referring to mandolins costing over $1,000. And I'm thinking especially of Eastman and Kentucky Saga brand. Well, frankly, I differ in my opinion with that statement. I have played Chinese instruments that are good. And some of them indeed are Kentucky brand made by Saga. We sell some that have German, or Swiss, excuse me, Swiss alpine spruce and Swiss alpine maple. David Gartland, who works at Saga, told me he personally bought that wood after one of the shows in Frankfurt, Germany. They have an annual international music fair. It's used to be one of the biggest in the world. It's not as big as it used to be. Actually, the NAMM show in Anaheim, California is sort of taken over as being the great one now. Plus there's shows in Frankfurt, aside from Frankfurt, excuse me, in Shanghai. The Shanghai show is getting to be quite big. If you want to see Chinese made instruments, that's where to go. But made in China does not automatically mean super cheap or tinny sounding. I have commented that I've shown on previous shows guitars from Altamira, classical, and a gypsy jazz style guitar that they don't sound tinny to my ear. They're good guitars. A good guitar can be made with good wood in China or here if it's made by a skilled craftsman. And the quality of guitars made in China is much better than it used to be, but not all factories are created equal. And that's true in the US, it's true in Spain, it's true in Germany, Italy, wherever you want to look. There are some companies and some individual luthiers that make student model instruments. There are others that specialize in really high end. But I can certainly show you a Chinese-made guitar, and I can also show you, I don't have it handy within reach right here on the second floor, but we have Chinese-made mandolins, Kentucky brand, that have Swiss Alpine neck, back, sides, and Swiss Alpine spruce. And they sound good. And they sound, to my ear, good enough to take on stage and use professionally. Are they better than the really high-end vintage Gibsons? No. But are they good enough to take on stage and use professionally and to be able to truthfully say that they don't sound thin and tinny? Yeah, they're good enough to do that. And to just assume everything out of China is bad is just a mistake. It would be the same as saying all cars made in China are junk. Well, a new Volvo isn't junk. And now there are major automotive companies doing quite a few high-end brands in China as well as in the US. And just because a brand started in England or Germany, if they have a factory in the US, the quality may be the same. And if that same company sets up a factory in China, they can also have high end. And China, as a country, is much more wealthy than it used to be. There are now just about as many billionaires in China as there are in the USA. Now, the average annual per capita income in China is much less than in the US, but they got a lot more capitas, and their upper class, while it may be a small percentage of the population, is a lot of people. And those people have money. And they are interested in good instruments for their own domestic consumption. And there are good instruments made for Chinese home buyers, and some of those are exported also. And just for jollies, I'm going to pick up a guitar and show it to you, since I can have it here in about 5 seconds. This is from Altamira. It's a copy of a 1858 Torres. It is an accurate copy. It has beautiful maple, which is what the original had, and beautiful spruce. It is elegantly well crafted, and it is an absolutely concert grade instrument, which we are selling for $4,500. It ain't junk. Now, they also make some much cheaper instruments. We have $1,200 from them, the Gypsy Jazz style Selmer copy that is also absolutely good enough to take on stage and use professionally. To say that China is incapable of making a good instrument is not true. Do I want to fill my store with Chinese-made instruments? No. But do I feel that some of them are worthy of being here? Absolutely yes. And do I think that Chinese manufacturers and individual luthiers are capable of building fine instruments? The answer is yes. And as time goes by, we'll see more and more of it. The same can be said of what was happening in Japan. Back in the 1960s, made in Japan pretty much meant junk. That's not true anymore. And even by 1974, when I went to Japan, I found that there were numerous instruments over there in stores and at a trade show that I visited in Tokyo at that time that were good quality, and they were designed for the domestic Japanese market. And they weren't being exported to the US because US distributors didn't want them, because it would have cost almost as much as buying a new Fender or Gibson would have cost, and it wouldn't have easily been marketable in the US as a result. It wouldn't have been competitive, but the quality was good. And in fact, as early as in the mid-1970s, there were Japanese makers producing remarkably accurate copies of vintage pre-CBS Fenders and early vintage Gibsons, such as Sunburst Les Pauls, and doing it before either Fender or Gibson were doing reissues. And they actually, if anything, may have prompted Gibson and Fender to get it in gear and start doing vintage instrument replicas, reissues, because they didn't want to be overshadowed by what was being done in Japan. Well, that was Japan. They started out making cheap, and they made cheap copies of the new American instruments of the time. Then they got to making better quality. Then they got to discovering that the vintage American instruments were really more sought after over here and brought more money, and that Japanese customers wanted them and were importing from the US to Japan these vintage instruments. And they started copying those rather than the new ones. And the Chinese learned too. And China is a formidable competitor these days, making some instruments that do have genuine merit. So again, they're cosmetically better, and sonically, some of them are better. Interestingly enough, the very next question from a person named John says, you have mentioned during previous webinars that over time, Chinese-built guitars have improved somewhat in quality, and I would say they've improved a lot. Comparing Gibson's American-built Les Paul Custom with list prices ranging from $6,000 to $7,500 to Epiphone's Chinese-built Les Paul Custom selling for $700 to $800, you think Gibsons are worth almost 10 times more than Epiphones in terms of materials, workmanship, and sound? Well, the fact is that yes, the Gibsons are worth more, and they are better than the Epiphones that are coming in. And one thing I can say on that is that the Epiphones that come in, and in general, excuse me, other companies that have an American line and an import line, their imports are not as good as their USA-made main brand. does that mean that the quality that is capable of being built in Japan, Korea, or elsewhere is simply that they don't have the capability? Or does it mean that if you're Gibson or Fender, do you want your import to be fully as good as the one you make in the American factory? That might not be good for your marketing. You might deliberately want to make it a lesser instrument. The Mexican Fender guitars have basically the same neck dimensions and body dimensions as the US ones, but they don't have as good component electronics and hardware. Now, if you change some of the components and hardware, all of a sudden, whoop-de-doo, they're better, but they're not better than the American ones because often enough the wood on the body isn't the same, even though it's the same dimensions. But my point is, are the Chinese capable of building a guitar fully as good as a new Les Paul? I wouldn't put it past some of them to be able to do that. But is Gibson, or for that matter, is Fender likely to import one that is absolutely equivalent in quality to their premier US made product? That wouldn't necessarily be good marketing for them. So they quite deliberately don't do that. So that's another thought. Another question. Long ago, I owned a Lohr 600 model mandolin along with the 700 model, which were its top-end products. The 600 had surprisingly good sound for an under $1,000 price. The instrument seemed to be well constructed with good wood, but the nitrous cellulose finish was rather thick. One luthier and a couple of pickers speculated on what the instrument would sound like if the finish were removed. Have you heard of anybody removing a thick finish from a low-end mandolin and resulting in an improved tone? Well, if you have a really thick, goopy finish, it will sound better with the finish thinned down. You may not have to remove all of it. You might be able to sand through some of it, but it's hard to sand it all uniformly and get a great result. But it's also probably not nitrocellulose. If it was a low-end instrument, many of those import models have a finishes that are polyurethane, and that finish, if it's thick, does effectively mean a thick plastic coating on the instrument, which really will dampen sound. So thin finishes are usually best, regardless of what type finish it is. But if it's an extremely thick finish, and if it's especially on an import instrument, I wouldn't count on it being nitrocellulose. We have another question. There are so many Telecaster models now, reissues and deluxes and ultras, which has the most authentic Tele sound? Well, I think if you get down to it, if you want the most authentic Tele sound, then you get the one that Fender themselves call the one that would be the most authentic. They make vintage reissues. And if you have a custom shop model, those things, if they claim they have vintage specs, that's the one to do. Not everybody is looking always for vintage specs. They may want push-pull pots or whatever, or split coils and numerous things that many modern players want. But again, the ones that sound the most like a vintage one are the ones that Fender themselves claim are built to do that. Gail, not Claire, Gail says, I inherited my grandfather's 1955 Telecaster some 30 years ago. It was appraised by Gruhn's by way of photos about 20 years ago. Something which I probably need to do again. That said, I have questions, and yes, 20-year-old appraisal is not going to be valid today. There are two old holes on the front of the guitar. Do you have any inkling what they may be from? Well, I'll have to check the photos because they didn't give them to me. But very likely holes in the front are from either a vibrato, or if somebody set it up with a MIDI pickup, that will put two holes in the top. I believe the black paint is an early do-it-yourself paint job and have yet to come across a trace of the original finish. Is it a given that it was butterscotch? If it was a 55 Telly, it was probably a more ivory color blonde. The butterscotch color blonde is typical of 54 on back, but starting in 55, they typically have a more ivory color to them rather than that yellowish butterscotch. But would Fender have records of what the color was? No, but standard color for the Telly at that time was the ivory blonde, and there were hardly any made in custom color Tellys in 55. That would be an extremely rare item to be a custom color. Says she's due for a string change, which I generally do myself and do a bit of cleanup at the same time on close examination. She seemed to have crossed the line from patinaed to grimy. Is there anything I ought to do aside from wiping down with a soft cloth and maybe using a couple of Q-tips to get in crevices? In general, when they get that grimy, I would take it to a good repairman and see what they recommend, because getting too far into it and buffing too hard can really damage things. And I don't know what's it's grimy with. So I'm going to be rather cautious and say, rather than do it yourself, take it to somebody who's good, and you don't necessarily have to pay them to do it, but let them look at it and analyze, why is it grimy? Is it tobacco smoke? Is it sweat? Is it some other kind of dirt? And what kind of solvents are likely to do that job? And for metal hardware and other kinds of grime, they're not all the same answer. They're asking if I know a luthier in the Baltimore area knowledgeable in vintage instruments. That would, of course, be basically getting into the Washington, D.C. area. And there are a number of dealers in that area. And in fact, well, I don't know exactly which one is the best to recommend in that area. Martin Guitar Company has online a list of recommended repair facilities, and the same people will be good for electric instruments typically, as well as acoustic. If you just go to the Martin Guitar website, I recommend doing that. And I believe that Fender and Gibson probably will also have a list of recommended repair facilities. Same person has a question. And lastly, a philosophical question. When is a guitar not a guitar, but a museum piece? I get a lot of static from people who think I shouldn't play Grandpa's Telly, and for a long time was too intimidated to do anything with it. But in my 50s now, having survived an aggressive form of cancer, I've given myself permission. I'm not looking for you to tell me what to do, but I'd like to hear more about your philosophy. Seems to me musical instruments have a heart, soul, all of their own, and they are meant to be played. I agree that they should be played. And, but there are some that I think are museum pieces that are probably not the greatest to play. For example, I have 1836 Martin Stauffer designed guitar I showed last week on camera. And that's one that is really better as a museum piece. I also have an 1842 Martin that I'd say that, but what you have is a Telecaster that you're saying has been refinished and has holes in it. That's a utility guitar. I would not for a moment say that that's a museum piece or that you shouldn't play it. That's one that if we had it, we would want to set it up in good playing order. And since the finish is not original, we would have no hesitation in refinishing it. And if we were to refinish it, those two holes in the top could probably be made to disappear where they could not be seen at all. And that's what we would do. And then it could be played. But that is not a guitar that is so pristine that I'd be afraid to play it. If you have a 1952 Tele that looks absolutely out of the box new, has never, ever, ever been played, doesn't have a single scratch, if you use it as a utility tool and if you treat it at all roughly, it's going to lose over $10,000 of value real quick. And for that, frankly, I put that into the category of museum piece and not play it. I'd just get another one to play and have that one for display. Or else, if you're never going to use it, you just want the money, cash it out, sell it to somebody who is a strictly collector who will not beat it up. But things like that are so rare in absolutely mint condition. And the value is hurt so much. If you play it, it's sort of like coin collecting. If you have an uncirculated mint rare coin, if you get as much as one fingerprint on it, the value can go down by as much as 50%. Don't do that. Use one that has a bit of wear. That's one of the nice things, by the way, about the relic finish guitars. Well, I think sometimes it's amusing to me they charge extra for a relic finish. I can at least say if you get a brand new guitar and you play it, it's going to get scratches on it and its resale value will go down. But still, you're not going to get any use out of it if you don't play it. It was meant to be played. But if you buy one of the relic finish ones and has lots of fake scratches on it, if you yourself play it and get a few more scratches on, you know what? Its value doesn't go down because you can't tell which scratches you put there and which came there. And they maintain their value better than buying one that is absolutely brand new looking and doesn't have a single scratch. I get people who just get so bent out of shape that they look at new guitars and they want to see if the factory left any buffing scratches or marks. And you know, they're so fussy on how new it must be that they only want something that's straight out of the box. They don't want anything that's been on the wall that we might have touched or that a player might have gotten a scratch or a little fingernail mark on the pick guard. Well, yeah, that's, I think, a bit unrealistic if a music store is actually going to demonstrate guitars and have them available where people might try one. But the idea that your guitar must be pristine, totally perfect, they want more perfection than Stradivari or Guarneri ever did on a violin that today might bring $10 million and more perfection than Martin ever achieved pre-World War II. Thomas Van Tilburg, another question from him. I'm curious as to whether you've ever done anything with Joe Bonamassa besides being a talented guitarist. It seems like he's trying to buy up all the Gibson Golden Era guitars. Well, we've sold Joe quite a few guitars, Gibsons and Fenders, but no one person is going to corner the whole market. That's just not going to happen. Joe's a good customer for us and for numerous other dealers. And he's a great player. He also takes good care of his guitars. Ken Waltham, what gauge strings should I use on my 1941 D18? Dreadnought size Martins respond best with medium gauge strings. And the 1941 should be a very good guitar. Won't bring quite as much money as the ones made from 34 through late 38. with the forward shifted scallop bracing, but it's still an extremely good guitar. And definitely something that was designed for medium strings and will sound best. You can put light gauge on it and it'll be physically a bit easier to play, but it'll put out less volume. And as I said, it was designed for mediums. Jackie Ezel, when would you find it justified to overspray a vintage guitar? The answer to that is never. We would not do that. People overspray guitars to try to make them look more new, but it greatly reduces monetary value. And when possible, if we get a guitar that is oversprayed, sometimes we can actually carefully remove the finish and get back down to the original finish. But the answer to when is it justified to do it, the answer is don't do that. Eric says, can you talk briefly on which, if any, Fender Strats would have dowel marks on the body from the manufacturing process? And my understanding is that they can come from old machines in the Fullerton factory. And in general, the marks you're talking about are more likely to be on very early Fenders. But usually, more what you see is nail holes where they actually used, they would drive nails in position under the pick guard, where they would rest the body after it was sprayed. They could put it down on the nails and let it dry on both sides. And then they could pull those nails and they didn't have to fill them in with dowels. So far as large size dowels in the body, they didn't do that. So without photos, I'm not quite sure what you're talking about. John Parsons asks, since I had mentioned Birch earlier, is there any reason why Birch isn't used much these days for guitars? Is supply limited? Birch is quite readily available. And in general, it has less prestige than maple, but we've actually seen some Birch that's quite attractive. My Lloyd Loar signed L5 guitar that I paid $50,000 to buy has Birch back and sides. They did a few with maple very, very late in 24, but mine's a December 1st, 24, and it still has the Birch back and sides. And actually, when I say mine is December 21st, the label was signed on December 1st, excuse me, not 21, December 1st. That doesn't mean the guitar was actually even finished on December 1st. They put the label in that happened to have a December 1st signature, but the guitar could have been made a bit earlier and waited to get the label, and or it could have been made later than that, and the labels were signed in bulk. So at any rate, Birch can produce a really good sound, and my guitar with Birch back and sides is what I consider to be an absolutely superb sounding instrument. You don't find, by the way, going back to the thing about nail holes or dowels, no, you don't find that on the post-CBS guitars. Now that covers a good bit of what was asked. There's always more than can be said. There are wide varieties of different types of wood that can produce great results and really fine sounding guitars. On a previous show, for example, I showed a guitar made with paulownia wood, sometimes called the Empress tree. And I have seen some very fine guitars made with walnut. And in fact, I can show you a walnut guitar, a classical, that is quite a good instrument. Get that. This is a guitar made by a British builder, Fleeson, Martin Fleeson. This particular one was built in 1979. This has walnut back and sides, English walnut, and a cedar top. And famous classical player John Williams played a Fleeson guitar. He's not using Fleesons presently, but back when he was still, he's a very well-known player, but he did for quite a while use a Fleeson as one of his guitars. And it's possible to build a remarkably good guitar with walnut neck, back, and sides. And many old Epiphones had walnut, and in fact, some of the instruments by Orville Gibson, as well as very early Gibson Company instruments, had walnut back and sides on mandolins and guitars, walnut neck, back, and sides. So historically, walnut has been used, and even more recently, Martin has done some models back in the 1980s. They did some runs of guitars with walnut. They had a D16W, a walnut guitar, and it was pretty darn good. So it is possible to do that. Different materials can work well. And one of the more intriguing ones, the more I've been playing it, the more I'm highly impressed with the guitar with the Paulownia wood. And I think I'll get that one out and show that again. That's a guitar that when it first came in, before it was played in, it had only been strung up for a day before it was shipped to me. But this is a guitar that has turned out, in my opinion, to be quite a remarkable instrument. I'll have that in a moment. Here we have, this is a guitar that was built by Gallup, Brian Gallup in Michigan. And the guitar has only two types of wood in it: the top, sides, back, neck, interior neck block and end block, bracing, and the linings that hold the top to the sides and back to the sides are also all Paulownia wood, sometimes called the Empress tree. It's a tree native to China. And the fingerboard, peghead veneer, the bridge, and the bindings are a wood that they were referring to as Texas ebony, sometimes called ironwood. But it is a wood that grows in Texas and down into Mexico. It looks a lot like ebony. It's dense, it's hard, it's strong. And this is a guitar that is light in weight. It's very responsive. And I've been playing it myself a bit lately. And I've been showing it around to some very good players. And so far, everybody who's played it has claimed that they really like it. It is a good sounding instrument. So I'll play a tune on it, and you can get at least some notion of what I'm talking about, with the caveat that I've told it before. My lifetime earnings playing guitar is now up to $49 from $63 to the present. So. sounds better when Vince Gill, Brian Sutton, John McEwen, and some of the others have played it, but it's been played by a lot of great musicians, and all of them so far have said that this is a wood with real potential. It's pretty amazing because it's lighter weight than spruce. It's warp resistant. It looks good. It grows incredibly fast. You can see annual growth rings here. It can be like here. That's 1 year's growth between those two lines, over an inch. It can grow to a full-size harvestable tree in 10 years. And when you cut the tree, the stump will sprout a new one, and you can do that 7 times over. It's warp resistant, it's structurally strong and stable, it's resistant to moisture, it is a good structural wood for construction purposes, not only of guitars, but numerous other items. And this wood was grown on President Jimmy Carter's farm, and it's part of a project with the President Carter Foundation and the World Tree Project. And so it's something quite fascinating, and I'm pleased to be involved with this, at least insofar as having tested this guitar and giving them my opinion on its merits, which I think are very considerable. So there are new interesting developments going on in the guitar world. It's not static. And again, we're sort of at the end of our time now for the week. I'll look forward to more in the future. Next week, we will be taking a break. And Sarah, we are next week?
We're going to be on next week.
Ah, we are going to be on. Okay. So I thought we were going to be taking a break next week. I'm pleased to announce we are not taking a break next week. That's great. I am well pleased because, frankly, I enjoy doing these. And there had been a plan that we might not do it next week, but we're gonna. So we will be on. I am looking forward to it. And these are presentations I will be doing as long as you keep sending in interesting questions, as long as people want to tune in. I want to be on because I enjoy doing this. I think it's very constructive. And please keep those questions coming in. And in the meantime, remember, you can always reach me at the shop. You can call 615-256-2033. I'm here 6 days a week. You can email me, George, at guitars, GUITARS.com. And I do read those and I do respond. So please keep it coming. And I'll look forward to being back with you next week.